Hey guys, tonight we'll step into a world of excess, indulgence, and the fascinating history of Roman banquets. Picture yourself at a grand feast, the air thick with the smell of roast meats, the sound of lively conversation, and the clink of silver goblets. You're surrounded by the elite of Roman society, all reclining on plush couches, eating and drinking far more than any modern person would dare. But be warned, you probably wouldn't survive this experience, not without getting into some serious trouble. Between the excesses and the rules, ancient Roman banquets were quite the event. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Where are you tuning in from tonight? Let me know your location and local time in the comments. Always fun to see where we're traveling together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Roman banquets weren't just about food. They were social rituals, opportunities to display wealth and power, and sometimes even political maneuvering. These feasts were far from simple meals. They were spectacles, carefully curated to impress and often to one-up rivals. You'd find yourself surrounded by guests, reclining in luxury, while slaves scurried around with a seemingly endless stream of exotic dishes, luxurious wines, and sometimes the oddest foods you could imagine. Roman elites loved their banquets to be lavish, filled with food, wine, and entertainment. Everything was designed to show off wealth and status. But it wasn't always as glamorous as it sounds. These feasts, while beautiful and decadent, could sometimes be downright dangerous. Let's take a closer look at what a typical Roman banquet was like, where it all started, and why it became such an essential part of Roman life. As we dive deeper, let's start at the very beginning. How did the tradition of Roman banquets come to be? Well, feasts were part of nearly every ancient civilization. The Romans took it to another level entirely. In fact, the roots of Roman banquets can be traced back to the Etruscans, an ancient civilization that greatly influenced Roman culture. The Etruscans were known for their lavish feasts, and they paved the way for the Roman love affair with banquets. In the early days of Rome, banquets were tied to religious ceremonies and public celebrations. Roman feasts were often held to honor gods and mark important occasions like military victories or political achievements. The first banquets, however, weren't all about luxury. They were simple affairs, mostly for the upper class, where bread and wine were shared in honor of the gods. But as Rome's power and wealth grew, so did the scale of their feasts. By the time of the Roman Republic and into the empire, banquets had become not only a way to celebrate, but also a way to demonstrate one's social standing. The more extravagant the feast, the higher your status in Roman society. banquets became tools of political and social influence, a way to display your wealth, alliances, and power to the public and other elites. It was during this time that the idea of lavish, excessive feasting truly flourished. Historians still argue whether the banquets in the early empire were genuinely extravagant out of necessity for displaying status, or whether the Romans were simply passionate about indulgence. Was it a social necessity, or just another way to pass the time and entertain? At these banquets, you were expected to engage in lively conversation, make alliances, and impress your peers, often in a luxurious, almost opulent setting. You could expect an elaborate layout of food, wine, and entertainment designed to keep you at the table as long as possible. It's easy to imagine how these gatherings, with their delicious food, wine, and the endless flow of conversation, could last for hours, or even days in some cases. So, the tradition of the Roman banquet was born out of a blend of religious devotion, social necessity, and, as the empire grew, pure indulgence. As the centuries passed, these feasts would only grow more extravagant. Now that we've set the scene for where Roman banquets began, let's talk about a key element that defined them: the symposium. If you've ever imagined ancient feasts filled with philosophers in togas sipping wine and discussing deep ideas, you're not too far off. This idea stemmed from the Greek tradition of the symposium. The Greek symposium was a drinking party, a social gathering of men where conversation and intellectual debates often took center stage. While the Roman version was more focused on indulgence and excess, the roots of Roman banquets can be traced to this Greek tradition. In the Roman Empire, these drinking parties were still a staple of upper-class life, but they evolved into more grandiose affairs. The Romans adopted the symposium and made it even more lavish. They added more food, more wine, and often more entertainment. These symposiums became spaces where wealthy men gathered to not only discuss philosophy, politics, or literature, but to flaunt their wealth and connections. It wasn't just about the discussions anymore. It was a way to prove your social standing. Historians still debate whether these events were truly intellectual or just another excuse to indulge. Some argue that the conversations at these banquets were filled with thought-provoking ideas, while others suggest that the excessive drinking made it difficult to have any coherent discussions at all. What's clear is that they were vital to Roman social life, at least for the upper crust of society. Now, picture yourself at one of these Roman symposiums. You're reclining on a couch, a glass of wine in hand, surrounded by friends or political allies. You're expected to entertain, but you're also expected to listen and engage in discussions that might range from the mundane to the profound. As the evening wears on, The wine flows freely, the conversation turns livelier, and, perhaps, a bit more ridiculous. But this was the Roman way. The symposium wasn't just a meal. It was a place for connection, conversation, and, yes, indulgence. Of course, it wasn't all about intellectual discussions. The Romans also brought their own brand of fun to these events. At these parties, guests might sing, play instruments, or even engage in theatrical performances. And just when you think the conversation couldn't get more absurd, a comedic sketch might break out, or someone would challenge you to a drinking contest. So, the Roman symposium was an essential part of Roman feasts, with roots in Greek tradition, but transformed into something uniquely Roman, a blend of intellectual conversation, socializing, and ultimately a way to celebrate one's status. Let's move on to another key aspect of these Roman feasts: the attire. While the food and wine might get all the attention, what you wore at a banquet was just as significant. Roman banquets were a public display of wealth and social standing, so how you dressed was an important part of the equation. The Romans had a specific dress code that reflected your social status, and these rules were strictly adhered to during banquets. The highest-ranking Romans wore elaborate tunics and togas made from fine wool or silk, often adorned with intricate patterns and bright colors. The toga, a heavy, draped garment that could be quite difficult to manage, was a sign of Roman citizenship and was worn by men in the most formal settings. But there were different styles of toga for different occasions, and at a banquet, the toga would be more decorated than usual to showcase the wearer's affluence. For the wealthiest guests at these banquets, wearing the right toga was essential. It wasn't just about looking good. It was about showing that you belonged at the elite level. The toga could be expensive, especially if it was dyed with the rare purple pigment made from sea snails. This color was reserved for emperors and senators, so you can imagine how important it was to sport that specific shade when you wanted to make a lasting impression at a banquet. However, if you weren't of the elite class, your attire would be more modest. The average Roman citizen might wear a simpler tunic, sometimes made of coarser fabric, without the flashy adornments of the wealthy. Slaves, who were often present at the feasts serving food and drink, wore simple garments, usually just a plain tunic or cloth, marking their lower social standing. The act of reclining at the banquet also influenced the choice of clothing. Romans would lie on couches in a semi-reclining position, which required specific garments that were both comfortable and practical. This also meant that men didn't have to worry about the constricting belts or clothing that we might wear today, so they could focus more on enjoying their food, wine, and conversation without being bothered by their attire. Historians still argue whether the obsession with dressing to impress was a sign of Roman vanity or just an essential part of the culture. What's clear, though, is that the social power of appearance was very much alive and well during these gatherings, and your choice of clothing said just as much about your place in Roman society as your words or actions. So, as you attend this Roman feast in your mind's eye, imagine yourself adorned in the finest toga, reclining on a plush couch, the center of attention, at least for the moment. After all, in the world of Roman banquets, appearance was everything. Now, let's take a stroll into the actual banquet halls, the places where all this luxury and excess took place. Roman banquets weren't held in just any room. They were celebrated in beautifully decorated spaces designed to enhance the lavish nature of the event. Imagine stepping into a grand hall, walls adorned with intricate frescoes depicting gods, goddesses, and heroic scenes from mythology. The floors were often covered in colorful mosaics, designed not only to look beautiful, but also to show off the wealth and taste of the host. Roman banquets were typically held in the homes of the elite, in spaces known as tricliniums, a type of dining room named after the three couches that were used for reclining. The triclinium was the centerpiece of the banquet space, with three large couches arranged in a U shape around a low dining table. The guests would recline on these couches, supported by cushions, and eat from the table in front of them. The U shape of the seating allowed guests to easily interact with one another, engage in conversation, and be part of the festivities while being comfortable. These banquet halls were often extravagantly furnished, with couches covered in plush fabrics and cushions, and low tables made of fine wood or marble. The tables were sometimes decorated with garlands of flowers or scattered with rose petals, adding to the opulent atmosphere. The lighting was provided by oil lamps, casting a soft, warm glow over the entire scene, which would have created a serene, intimate environment for the guests. The food, of course, would be the highlight of the banquet, but the setting was just as important in creating the perfect environment for eating, drinking, and socializing. Banquets weren't just about satisfying hunger. They were about showcasing wealth, culture, and taste. The decorations, the furniture, the very layout of the room all played a role in enhancing the experience of indulgence. Historians still argue whether Roman banquet halls were always as grand as we like to imagine them. Some suggest that only the wealthiest citizens could afford such lavish spaces, while others claim that even middle-class Romans had fairly impressive tricliniums for their own gatherings. What's undeniable, however, is that the grand banquet halls of Rome were a symbol of power and wealth. making them an integral part of the feasting experience. So, as you picture yourself lounging in the glow of oil lamps, reclining on a luxurious couch amidst colorful mosaics and soft fabrics, you begin to understand just how deeply woven these banquets were into the fabric of Roman society. The setting wasn't just a backdrop, it was part of the spectacle. Now that we've explored the grandeur of the banquet halls, let's focus on a key part of Roman banquets that often goes unnoticed: the slaves. Behind the scenes, it was the slaves who made these feasts run smoothly, from preparing the food to serving the guests. Their roles were crucial, and while the elite guests reclined and feasted, slaves worked tirelessly to ensure the banquet unfolded perfectly. Slaves were often trained specifically for their duties at banquets. Some were tasked with cooking the elaborate meals, while others served the food and drink, ensuring that guests were constantly satisfied. The more skilled slaves, known as coquilles, were responsible for preparing the intricate dishes that would be brought to the table. These coquilles were not just your average cooks. They were often trained in the art of creating visually stunning and sometimes bizarre dishes meant to dazzle and amuse. The slaves who served at the banquet also had their specific duties. Some were tasked with carrying around trays of food and drink, while others were there to entertain, offering snacks or taking care of guests' needs during the evening. They were responsible for making sure the guests were always comfortable, always had a full cup of wine, and were never left wanting. It was common for slaves to even be assigned to specific guests to ensure they were well attended throughout the evening. Interestingly, there were also entertainer slaves who performed at these events. These slaves were often musicians, dancers, or even gladiators who provided entertainment for the guests. Some banquets included live performances, with slaves dancing or playing music to keep the atmosphere lively and to further impress the guests. Historians still debate the exact treatment of slaves at these banquets. Some argue that while their work was essential, the lavish nature of the events may have also led to a certain level of dehumanization. On the other hand, others suggest that slaves who were skilled in these arts were often treated with more respect, at least within the context of the feast. Regardless, their roles were indispensable, and the smooth functioning of a Roman banquet was often a reflection of how well these slaves performed their duties. Imagine, then, that you are a slave at one of these banquets, while the elite are lounging in their fine clothes, eating and drinking to their heart's content. You are running around, ensuring that every need is met, working behind the scenes to keep everything running smoothly. Your role, though hidden, is central to the success of the evening. As we delve into the menu of these Roman banquets, it becomes clear that food was not just a necessity, it was a statement. The Romans prided themselves on their ability to gather a variety of foods from all corners of their empire, showcasing their vast wealth and global reach. Roman banquets were a true feast for the senses, not only in taste, but also in visual spectacle. What would you expect to see on the table? The answer is both familiar and strange. The Romans were masters of mixing flavors, and their culinary style was characterized by elaborate combinations of sweet and savory, which could be quite unusual by modern standards. A typical banquet spread might include roasted meats like boar, venison, and lamb, but also more exotic items like peacock, flamingo, and even dormice, which were considered a delicacy. The Romans were known for their penchant for showcasing bizarre foods, and dormice were sometimes stuffed with minced meat and roasted whole, a dish that would certainly raise an eyebrow today. The Romans also enjoyed fish, especially those from the Mediterranean. The prized fish, known as garum, a fermented fish sauce, was used as a seasoning and served with many dishes, much like soy sauce is used in modern Asian cuisine. It was often added to sauces and dishes to enhance the flavor, and its production was a thriving industry in the Roman Empire. Fruits, nuts, and vegetables were also a part of the Roman banquet, but they were often prepared in unique ways. Dates, figs, and apples were common, and the Romans had a particular fondness for the humble cabbage, which was often served in various forms. It was believed to have medicinal properties, so it appeared frequently in banquets, both as a food item and as a component in health-conscious dishes. Historians still argue about the true nature of Roman cuisine. Some suggest that the Romans had more refined palates than we give them credit for, while others believe that their food choices were based more on showmanship than taste. What we can say for certain is that Roman banquets were about far more than just feeding the body. They were an expression of power, wealth, and culture. Now, picture yourself seated at one of these lavish banquets, surrounded by strange and exotic foods. The air is thick with the scent of roasting meat and aromatic herbs, and a variety of colorful fruits and dishes are spread across the table before you, each dish more extravagant than the last. You're about to experience flavors that no modern-day banquet could ever compare to, except perhaps the discomfort of being full beyond belief. Now that we've tantalized your taste buds, let's explore one of the most important aspects of Roman banquets: how the food was presented. To the Romans, the appearance of food was just as crucial as its taste. The idea was to create a feast that was not only delicious, but also visually striking. And it wasn't uncommon for food to be served in ways that seemed more like a work of art than something you'd actually eat. One of the most striking aspects of Roman banquet presentations was the use of exotic, or rare ingredients. For example, fruits and vegetables would often be carefully arranged in patterns, while meats might be served in unusual ways, like whole fish or birds, to amaze and amuse guests. The Romans enjoyed impressing their guests with how food was displayed, sometimes going as far as arranging meat and fish to look like works of art or even animals. Imagine a peacock being served with its feathers still intact, roasted and brought to the table to wow the guests with its beauty and exoticism. Additionally, some banquets took the idea of presentation even further, preparing food in ways that might have seemed fantastical to the modern mind. One such example is the practice of mock dishes, where food was made to look like something entirely different. For instance, a roasted pig might be stuffed with various other animals, and when the pig was carved, it would reveal a whole turkey or even a chicken within. This sense of surprise and spectacle was essential to the Roman banquet experience. One of the most famous instances of elaborate food presentation is the Banquet of Trimalchio, a scene from the Roman novel Satyricon. In this story, the wealthy freedman Trimalchio hosts a banquet that is so lavish and over the top that it's filled with absurd dishes meant to impress and amuse. At one point, a dish containing a dormouse, stuffed with meat, nuts, and more, was served with much fanfare, followed by a seemingly endless parade of extravagant dishes designed to make the guests gasp in astonishment. Historians still argue about the practicalities of these displays. Were these extravagant presentations the norm at every banquet, or were they the result of wealthy hosts trying to outdo each other? Regardless, it's clear that the Romans had a flair for theatricality, and their feasts were as much about putting on a show as they were about satisfying hunger. As you sit back at this imaginary banquet, your plate is filled with strange yet stunning food, some so beautifully presented that you hesitate to eat it. And just as you're about to take a bite of something unfamiliar, the next extravagant dish arrives, more dazzling than the last. The food isn't just about nourishment. It's about making you feel like you've stepped into a world of extravagance and power. You're not just a guest, you're part of the spectacle. As the evening wears on, the focus shifts from food to one of the most important elements of Roman banquets: drinking. The Romans didn't just drink wine, they celebrated it. And, much like their food, the consumption of wine was a carefully crafted experience, complete with rituals and etiquette. The role of wine at a banquet was so significant that it was woven into the fabric of Roman social life. Let's start with the wine itself. In the Roman world, wine was the drink of choice, and it came in all kinds of varieties. It wasn't just the rich reds and whites we might imagine today. Romans drank wine that ranged from sweet and syrupy to vinegar-like, and it was often diluted with water. Drinking undiluted wine was seen as barbaric, so guests at a banquet could expect their wine to be cut with water in varying proportions, depending on their social status. The elite would enjoy wine that had been diluted just a little, while lower class Romans might find their wine watered down quite heavily. Historians still debate the exact way Romans diluted their wine. Some believe that the wine was diluted by as much as half with water, while others suggest that a more modest dilution of 1 part water to 2 parts wine was more common. What's clear is that wine was central to Roman social life, and the art of drinking was just as important as the food. The next big piece of the Roman drinking experience was the symposium. During these drinking parties, the host often served wine in a specific order to guide the drinking and ensure that the evening would flow smoothly. The Romans would also often drink in a very structured way, using specific cups and rituals. A host would offer a ceremonial cup of wine at the beginning of the feast, symbolizing the start of the evening celebrations. Throughout the night, guests would drink and toast to various gods, to political achievements, or to one another. The Roman belief in Dionysian revelry meant that wine drinking was often seen as an act of surrendering to the divine, a ritual as much as a pleasurable indulgence. However, like many things in Roman society, the act of drinking wasn't free from social conventions. Banquet guests were expected to maintain certain behaviors while drinking. For example, one of the most important rules was moderation, at least until the wine started to flow too freely. It wasn't uncommon for guests to drink far more than was deemed appropriate, resulting in hilariously chaotic moments during banquets. In fact, excessive drinking was a common way for the Romans to bond, as it gave them an opportunity to let loose and enjoy each other's company without the constraints of the everyday world. As you imagine yourself at this Roman banquet, the air is filled with the sound of laughter, lively chatter, and the clink of wine cups. The intoxicating aromas of food mix with the rich scent of wine, and the cups keep coming, one after another. You raise your glass to toast the host, perhaps a little too enthusiastically, and realize that you're partaking in an ancient tradition, a ritual that has been passed down for centuries. The wine flows as freely as the conversation, and as the evening drifts on, the line between celebration and indulgence blurs just a little more. While the wine may flow freely and the conversation may reach new heights of inebriated brilliance, Roman banquets were about more than just food and drink. Entertainment played a crucial role in setting the tone and keeping guests engaged throughout the night. Roman elites understood that no banquet could truly be memorable without providing some form of entertainment, whether it was music, performances, or even games. The entertainment at these feasts was designed to stimulate the senses, elevate the social atmosphere, and, in many cases, add a touch of grandeur to the evening. Musicians, dancers, and performers were common sights at Roman banquets, offering everything from live instrumental music to theatrical performances. The Romans had a deep appreciation for the arts, and no banquet would be complete without some form of entertainment to captivate guests. For those who attended banquets in the homes of the wealthy, they could expect to be entertained by professional musicians or trained slaves, skilled in playing instruments like the lyre, the flute, or even the aulos, a type of double-piped wind instrument. These musicians would often play soft, melodic music in the background, creating an atmosphere of relaxed luxury. The music was soothing, designed to blend into the background and enhance the dining experience without distracting from the conversations happening at the table. However, it wasn't all about mellow tunes. Roman banquets were also known for their more boisterous entertainment. For example, dramatic recitations or theatrical performances would sometimes be staged. These performances could be in the form of comic plays, short skits, or even dramatic reenactments of historical or mythological events. The dramatic flair was very much a part of Roman culture, and what better way to showcase this than through live performances at a banquet? Some banquets even featured more physical forms of entertainment, such as gladiator contests or mock battles. Though these extreme forms of entertainment were reserved for the very wealthiest and most powerful Romans, they were an undeniable part of the banquet experience. Guests could watch as trained fighters, sometimes even slaves, would engage in mock combat for their amusement. Historians still debate the scale and frequency of these extreme entertainments, with some suggesting that gladiatorial contests were not common at every banquet, but instead were reserved for the most extravagant events. Nevertheless, it's clear that entertainment at Roman banquets was not only an important part of the social fabric, but also a way for the host to elevate their status and impress their guests. As you sit at this opulent Roman feast, imagine the sounds of music, the laughter from a nearby performance, or even the shock of a gladiator contest unfolding before you. Every part of the evening is designed to keep you engaged, entertained, and awestruck. It's clear that in Rome, no banquet was complete without a little bit of flair, whether it came from the food, the drink, or the performances that surrounded you. While Roman banquets were undoubtedly luxurious affairs focused on indulgence, there was a far deeper layer to these gatherings that often gets overlooked: the politics of the feast. In the world of ancient Rome, Social events like banquets were far from casual get togethers. They were highly strategic occasions designed to cement alliances, sway political decisions, and ensure one's place in the ever shifting social hierarchy of the Roman elite. At a Roman banquet, the food was not the only thing being served. It was also an opportunity for power brokers to distribute favors, influence decisions, and, in some cases, manipulate the guests. You might think of it like a modern day political fundraiser, but with far more opulence, wine, and carefully measured etiquette. For the host, the banquet wasn't just about providing a good time for the guests, it was about securing their loyalty and cultivating future opportunities. For example, politicians and senators would often host elaborate feasts to woo potential allies, showing them not just the best food and entertainment, but also their generosity and power. The banquet became a venue for persuading others to vote in favor of particular policies or align themselves with a particular cause. By bringing people together in this extravagant setting, hosts could build relationships and set the stage for future collaborations, all under the guise of simply enjoying a feast. For the guests, attending these banquets wasn't just about food or fun. It was an opportunity to gain favor with those in power. Guests were often expected to show gratitude and respect toward the host, using their presence to publicly acknowledge their allegiance to the host's ambitions. This could involve complimentary speeches, toasts to the host's accomplishments, and subtle but important social signals that showed loyalty and camaraderie. Historians still argue how much political maneuvering actually took place during these feasts. Some suggest that the power plays were overt, with attendees openly discussing matters of state or personal business, while others argue that Roman banquets were mostly about maintaining appearances, with the real politics happening behind closed doors. Regardless, what is certain is that the very nature of these banquets, full of influential individuals and lavish offerings, made them fertile ground for political games. As you sit at this opulent banquet in your imagination, you realize that beneath the luxurious food, the flowing wine, and the charming entertainment, this event is more than just a celebration. It's a delicate dance of power and influence. The laughter and toasts you hear are laced with underlying strategies, each gesture or word carefully measured to maintain the delicate balance of Roman politics. As we've seen, Roman banquets were rife with politics, but let's now take a look at the role women played in these lavish gatherings. Roman society was, in many ways, patriarchal, with strict gender roles that defined the places of men and women in both public and private life. However, when it came to banquets, the role of women was complex and varied, depending on their social standing and the nature of the event. At the highest level of Roman society, women were often seen attending banquets alongside men, though their role was somewhat limited. They were typically relegated to the inner circle of guests, sitting with their husbands or male relatives and participating in the socializing, though their contributions to the conversation were often more subdued than their male counterparts. At elite banquets, it wasn't unusual to see women reclining on their own couches, enjoying the feast while being served by slaves, but they were not necessarily active participants in the more intellectual or political discussions that dominated these gatherings. That said, women of high status could wield considerable power in Roman society, and banquets were an opportunity for them to subtly exert influence. Their presence at these events was a form of social capital. Hosting a banquet could signal a woman's importance, particularly if she was the wife of a prominent politician, senator, or emperor. Wealthy Roman women, particularly those in the imperial court, were often known to host their own banquets, using the event as a way to entertain powerful men, secure political favor, and build alliances. However, the role of women at banquets wasn't always limited to just eating, reclining, and offering a graceful presence. Some women were known to have actively participated in conversations, providing insight into matters of state, managing finances, or even offering advice on public policies. It is said that Livia, the wife of Emperor Augustus, had significant influence in political affairs, using banquets as one of the venues to exert her power over the empire. While this was not the norm for all women, high-ranking females could, on occasion, use their participation in banquets to help shape the course of Roman politics. On the other hand, there were also lower-class women, often slaves, who had very different roles at banquets. These women worked as entertainers, musicians, dancers, or even prostitutes. Slaves and entertainers were integral to the functioning of a banquet, but their role was often invisible in the grand scheme of things. They provided the entertainment or were tasked with keeping the guests amused, their duties essential but largely unnoticed by the elite guests. Historians still debate the nature of women's participation in Roman banquets. Were they truly restricted to being passive observers? Or did they wield more power than the historical records suggest? Some argue that women's roles at these events were more dynamic than we realize, while others maintain that their contributions were far more subtle and indirect, often hidden behind the actions of their male counterparts. As you imagine yourself reclining at this Roman feast, notice the women around you. While some are quiet, their presence is undeniable. Whether it's the influential matron managing her own political alliances, or the entertainer keeping the guests amused. Their roles may not always be front and center, but they shape the dynamics of the evening just as much as the men. Now that we've explored the roles of both men and women at these grand Roman banquets, let's shift our focus to a crucial but often overlooked aspect of Roman feasts: the social divide between the rich and the poor. While the wealthiest Romans enjoyed unparalleled luxury at their banquets, the common people had a very different experience when it came to feasting. The food, the atmosphere, and even the guest lists were vastly different depending on your place in Roman society. For the elite, banquets were a form of conspicuous consumption, grand displays of wealth and power. The lavish feasts thrown by senators, emperors, and wealthy freedmen were meant to showcase their status, impress rivals, and solidify their political or social standing. These were not just meals. They were carefully constructed events designed to overwhelm the senses with luxury, where guests reclined on couches, ate exotic foods, and were entertained with music, performances, and sometimes even gladiatorial contests. But for the lower classes, banquets were much less grand. The common Roman citizen, especially those who worked as farmers, laborers, or in trade, might have had access to modest meals at local inns or at the homes of wealthier patrons. But their experiences of feasting were far more subdued. For these citizens, food was a necessity, and their social gatherings were more likely to involve simple dishes, basic bread, vegetables, and wine. While they may have attended public feasts, like those held during festivals or religious ceremonies, these were usually events that took place in the public sphere, not in the lavish private banquets of the elite. The distinction between these two worlds was clear, not just in what people ate, but also in where they dined. The poor would often eat on benches or standing in the streets, while the rich reclined on couches in beautifully decorated homes. The foods available to the poor were typically much more basic: stews made from grains, vegetables, and whatever meat could be afforded, perhaps supplemented by fish or eggs if the family was lucky. They were also far more likely to drink watered-down wine, as undiluted wine was a luxury for the wealthier class. Historians still debate whether this strict divide between the banquets of the rich and the poor was as rigid as it seems. Some argue that social class was much more fluid than we might think, with opportunities for the poor to partake in public feasts and festivals where they could mingle with the elite. Others suggest that the divide was deeply entrenched, with the wealth of the aristocracy creating a society that was starkly divided by class, even in the realm of food and entertainment. As you imagine yourself attending this Roman banquet, think about the vast gulf that separates you from the common folk. Your couch is luxurious, the food is exotic, and the wine is flowing freely. Meanwhile, outside, the poorer citizens are eating a simple meal in the public square, hoping for a chance to catch a glimpse of the opulence within the walls of the wealthy. The disparity between these two worlds is not just one of food, but of power, privilege, and social status. Let's now explore the feasts thrown by the emperors themselves, the most extravagant, over-the-top banquets in all of Rome. When an emperor hosted a banquet, it was not just a social gathering. It was an event that showcased imperial power, wealth, and absolute control. These banquets were a way for emperors to reinforce their authority, keep their subjects entertained, and remind the elite that they were subjects of a greater power. Emperor-hosted feasts were not merely about food and drink. They were meticulously orchestrated spectacles designed to awe and impress. Take, for example, the famous banquets held by Emperor Nero, one of the most infamous figures in Roman history. Nero was known for throwing lavish feasts, often lasting for days, where the food was as extravagant as the entertainment. His banquets were legendary for their excess, featuring exotic dishes like flamingo, peacock, and exotic fruits, all prepared and served in the most elaborate and impressive ways. Nero's feasts weren't just about impressing the elite. They were designed to show the people that their emperor had the power to provide such opulence at his whim. The seating at these banquets was equally extravagant. Nero, in particular, enjoyed making bold statements with the physical space where these events took place. His banquet halls were adorned with gold and precious gems, while the floors were often covered with soft furs to give guests a sense of indulgence and luxury. The guests at these imperial feasts were not just anyone. Only the highest-ranking members of society, those whose loyalty could be counted on, were invited. These banquets became a way for emperors to solidify their rule and, in some cases, to send a message to those who oppose them. Historians still debate the exact nature of Nero's feasts. Some believe that they were genuine attempts to bring pleasure and enjoyment to the people, while others argue that they were an act of supreme vanity, a way for Nero to demonstrate his power over life and death, to display his wealth and influence while keeping his subjects distracted from the realities of Roman political life. Regardless of intent, what's clear is that imperial banquets were a cornerstone of the emperor's public persona, a statement of his wealth, power, and divine favor. Imagine yourself seated at one of these imperial feasts. The lavish decor surrounds you, gold and precious stones glimmering under the light of oil lamps. The air is thick with the scent of rare meats and the sounds of music, laughter, and conversation. You're in the presence of the emperor himself, whose power looms over the event like a cloud. The food is exquisite, the wine flows freely, and the entertainment is unparalleled. This is not just a meal. This is an experience designed to remind you who is in charge and just how far that power stretches. As we continue to explore the opulence of Roman imperial banquets, it's important to understand that these lavish feasts were not just about indulgence and spectacle. They also played a significant role in the religious and spiritual life of ancient Rome. Banquets were often intertwined with religious rituals, offering an opportunity for Romans to honor their gods, seek divine favor, or commemorate important religious events. In many ways, these feasts were sacred as much as they were social. At a typical Roman banquet, the host would often begin the evening by making a toast to the gods, acknowledging their role in the feast and expressing gratitude for their blessings. Wine would be poured into a ceremonial cup, and the guests would join in the toast, offering their own praises and wishes. These toasts could be for specific gods, depending on the occasion: Jupiter for a political victory, Bacchus for a feast, or Venus for a celebration of love and beauty. Some banquets even featured sacrificial offerings to the gods, where animals would be slaughtered and their meat presented to the gods before being consumed by the guests. The connection between Roman banquets and religious rituals was particularly important for the ruling class, as hosting such feasts allowed them to demonstrate their devotion to the gods and their ability to commune with them. Emperors, in particular, would use banquets as a way to reaffirm their divine right to rule. By making offerings and performing religious rituals, they reinforce their status as chosen by the gods, ensuring that their power was seen as both legitimate and divinely sanctioned. Historians still debate how deeply ingrained religious practices were in Roman banquets. Were the feasts primarily secular social gatherings, or did they always carry a sacred, ritualistic undertone? Some argue that, over time, Roman banquets became less about religion and more about indulgence and politics, while others suggest that the religious aspect of these events remained deeply important throughout the empire's history. Imagine yourself sitting at one of these sacred feasts, the air filled with the scent of incense, as the host raises a goblet in a toast to the gods. The guests follow suit, their voices blending together in a chorus of prayers and wishes. You can feel the weight of the tradition, the ancient connection between the physical world of food and drink and the spiritual realm of divine favor. The feast is not only a celebration of life and abundance, but also a way to honor the divine forces that sustain it. Now that we've examined the deep connection between Roman feasts and religious rituals, let's turn our attention to a more alarming yet fascinating aspect of Roman banquets: the dangers of overindulgence. The Romans had a reputation for their love of excess, and while banquets were designed to indulge the senses, they were not without their risks. In fact, the culture of excessive eating and drinking at these events often led to dangerous consequences. For the wealthy elites, banquets were a way to flaunt not just their wealth, but their ability to consume in vast quantities. At these lavish events, the food was endless and the wine flowed freely, often to the point of gluttony. It wasn't uncommon for guests to gorge themselves on multiple courses, indulge in exotic dishes, and drink excessive amounts of wine until they were drunk, or, in some cases, beyond that. The act of overindulgence was not simply a sign of luxury. It was, in some ways, a status symbol. The more you could eat, drink, and endure, the more you showed off your wealth, strength, and tolerance. For the elite, being able to feast endlessly without consequence was seen as a display of power. But this excess came with risks. Ancient texts and satirical writings from the time often comment on the unpleasant realities of overconsumption at banquets, including instances where guests would make themselves sick in order to continue indulging. One infamous practice was vomiting during the feast to empty the stomach and prepare for more food. This was done using a vomitorium, though contrary to popular belief. The vomitorium was not a place where guests went to vomit, but rather an architectural feature that allowed for easy movement in and out of the banquet hall. Nevertheless, the idea of inducing vomiting to continue eating was a very real part of the banqueting culture for some Romans. Historians still debate the true extent of this overindulgence. Some suggest that it was exaggerated by satirists like Petronius in Satyricon, whose depiction of the banquet of Trimalchio shows guests vomiting and indulging to an absurd degree. Others argue that while these practices were likely more common among the very wealthy, they were not the everyday reality for most Romans. Either way, the link between gluttony and power was a significant part of the Roman banquet culture. Now, as you sit at this Roman feast, you find yourself partaking in the excess, the endless servings of meat, the cups of wine that never seem to stop. The food is delicious, but your stomach begins to feel the weight of it all. You notice others around you slurring their words, looking a bit too content with their indulgence. The atmosphere is jovial, but there's an undercurrent of discomfort. This is the world of excessive indulgence, where the pursuit of pleasure sometimes leads to its own undoing. With the dangers of indulgence in mind, let's delve into another aspect of Roman banquets that set them apart: their role in reinforcing the social hierarchy. In ancient Rome, everything, from the seating arrangements to the food served, was meticulously designed to reflect the strict social divisions within society. Banquets were a way to display your status, whether you were an emperor, a wealthy senator, or even a freed slave. At these events, who you sat with, who served you, and what food you ate all communicated your place in the Roman social order. For the wealthiest Romans, banquets were not just about indulgence. They were also about showcasing their superiority and power. The seating arrangements were particularly significant in signaling who was at the top of the social ladder. The host of the banquet would usually recline on a raised couch, surrounded by the most important guests. The elite guests, typically political allies, family members, or those who had recently earned favor, were seated closest to the host. As you move further from the host, the social status of the guests would decline. For those lower on the social scale, slaves, freedmen, or lower-ranking citizens, their place at the banquet was much more restricted. Slaves, of course, didn't have the luxury of reclining on couches. They were there to serve the guests, either bringing food, refilling cups, or assisting with entertainment. Freedmen, those who had been granted their freedom but still occupied a lower social position, might be allowed to attend, but would be relegated to the outer edges of the feast. They might be seated on lower couches, or even serve the higher status guests, despite being invited to the event. Even the food served reflected these distinctions. The most exotic and expensive dishes, like flamingo, peacock, or even roasted dormice, were typically reserved for the highest-ranking guests. Meanwhile, the lower-ranking individuals might be served more modest fare, like bread, lentils, or vegetables. At the same time, the wine served at the banquet was also divided by class. The richest guests would have wine that was less diluted and of better quality, while the wine of the lower class guests might be watered down heavily. Historians still argue about the extent to which Roman banquets reinforced social hierarchies. Some believe that the elaborate feasts were a form of social control, a way for the elite to remind everyone of their place in society. Others suggest that banquets served as opportunities for the lower classes to observe and learn from the wealthy, seeing firsthand how power and influence operated in Roman society. In either case, these gatherings were powerful demonstrations of the stark class divisions that defined Roman life. As you recline at the banquet, comfortable on your couch and enjoying the finest food and wine, you can't help but notice how the seating and food choices reflect the social divide. The closest guests to the host are engaged in lively conversation, discussing matters of politics and influence. Meanwhile, at the edges of the room, you see slaves rushing back and forth, ensuring the feast runs smoothly, but never partaking in the luxury themselves. Even in the midst of all this indulgence, the social divide is clear and, for some, inescapable. We've explored the role of social hierarchy at Roman banquets, but let's now shift gears and focus on one of the most vivid and often humorous depictions of Roman feasting, the infamous banquet of Trimalchio. This extravagant feast, immortalized in the Satyricon by Petronius, is one of the most outrageous portrayals of Roman indulgence, excess, and absurdity. The banquet of Trimalchio, hosted by a wealthy freedman, showcases the peak of Roman decadence. Everything is exaggerated, overdone, and designed to leave a lasting impression. Trimalchio is a character of obscene wealth and boundless arrogance, and his feast is a reflection of his personality. As the host, Trimalchio goes to great lengths to impress his guests, often crossing the line from indulgence to excess. The entire evening is a spectacle, with absurdly lavish dishes, over-the-top performances, and a bizarre attention to detail that seems to mock the very idea of moderation. The food at Trimalchio's banquet is an extravagant parade of bizarre dishes, each more excessive than the last. One of the most famous dishes served is a roasted pig, which is brought to the table with a very peculiar surprise. When the pig is cut open, it reveals a dozen stuffed birds, each with their own exotic filling. This isn't just about feeding guests. It's about showing off the host's wealth and creativity in a way that is both impressive and ludicrous. Imagine a banquet where food is served not just for nourishment, but for spectacle, where the culinary goal is to make your guests marvel at your ingenuity, no matter how ridiculous it may seem. But the absurdity doesn't end with the food. Trimalchio's banquet is filled with bizarre performances and entertainment, all designed to keep the guests in awe. There are slaves who perform ridiculous acts, like throwing a lavishly decorated ball that represents the cycles of life, with guests taking part in games and challenges. Trimalchio himself revels in the chaos, seemingly enjoying the attention more than the company of his guests. His behavior is a reflection of the new money mentality of the freedman class, who, in their attempt to show off their newfound wealth, often overdid it in every way imaginable. Historians still argue about what the banquet of Trimalchio represents in terms of Roman culture. Some see it as a satirical commentary on the excesses of the new wealthy class, the freedmen who, having acquired wealth, were eager to flaunt it in the most ostentatious ways possible. Others argue that Petronius, through this depiction, is critiquing the entire Roman elite, suggesting that all banquets, regardless of class, are ultimately an exercise in vanity and social competition. As you sit at this imaginary feast, Trimalchio himself is the center of attention, reveling in the laughter and the chaos he's created. The food is decadent, the performances outlandish, and the guests are caught in the frenzy of indulgence. It's not just a meal, it's an event designed to shock and entertain, to push the limits of what a Roman banquet can be. And Trimalchio is at the heart of it all, enjoying every moment. As we wrap up our exploration of Trimalchio's unforgettable banquet, let's turn to another aspect of Roman feasting that's bound to raise an eyebrow: some of the strangest foods Romans truly loved. If you've ever thought that modern cuisine has some odd dishes, the Romans could give you a run for your money. Roman feasts weren't just about the typical fare we think of today. They included some truly bizarre and exotic foods that often pushed the limits of what we would consider edible. Take, for example, dormice. Yes, you heard that right. Dormice, the small rodents, were considered a delicacy in Roman times. These creatures were often stuffed with a mixture of minced meat, spices, and nuts, and roasted to perfection. Imagine sitting at a banquet, and in front of you lies a perfectly roasted dormouse, its tiny legs and tail intact, ready to be devoured. If that isn't enough to make you reconsider your dinner, some reports suggest that these dormice were kept in special cages, fed a rich diet of figs and walnuts, and fattened up to ensure they were plump and tender for consumption. If you're not into dormice, maybe you'd prefer peacock, another favorite of the Roman elite. These birds were often prepared whole, with their feathers still attached, and brought to the table in a way that was meant to dazzle and impress guests. In the world of Roman banquets, the more unusual the food, the greater the status of the host. Another curious item often found at Roman feasts was garum, a fermented fish sauce that was used in almost everything, from meats to vegetables and even desserts. It was made by fermenting fish entrails in the sun for months, resulting in a salty, pungent sauce that the Romans absolutely loved. Garum was not just a food item, it was a part of the Roman culinary identity. It was the sriracha of ancient Rome, a condiment that could be added to anything and everything. The smell was notoriously intense, and modern researchers believe it could have been quite overpowering, but to the Romans, it was an essential part of their flavor profile. Then, of course, there were the exotic fruits that Romans would have relished, things like pomegranates, figs, and dates, fruits that could be found in abundance in the empire's vast territories. But for the truly wealthy, it wasn't enough to have just any fruit. The richest Romans would indulge in fruits that were considered rare or difficult to procure, including the infamous melon, which could cost an arm and a leg. Imagine sitting at a banquet where the fruits are as much a symbol of wealth as the rare meats and wine. Every bite a reminder of your place in Roman society. Historians still argue about the true nature of Roman food preferences. Were the Romans simply enamored with exotic foods for their rarity, or did they truly enjoy the unusual combinations? Some argue that the bizarre foods at banquets were just a way for the elites to flaunt their ability to acquire and consume what others could not. Others believe the Romans were genuinely fascinated by the novelty of new ingredients and flavors, seeing each meal as an opportunity to explore the world's vast culinary possibilities. As you picture yourself at this Roman feast, the table is brimming with exotic, strange, and sometimes unidentifiable foods. The dormice are stuffed and roasted. The garum sauce is being passed around, and the fruit is fresh and overflowing in golden bowls. The food is not just there to fill you up. It's there to show off, to amaze, and to challenge your senses. It's clear that in Rome, the banquet was as much about the novelty of the experience as it was about the food itself. Now that we've delved into the odd foods of Roman feasts, let's talk about the lasting impact of Greek culture on Roman banquets. The Romans, despite their many innovations, were deeply influenced by Greek customs, especially when it came to their feasts. As Rome expanded, it absorbed many aspects of Greek culture, and this included the art of banqueting. The Greek symposium was a major inspiration for Roman feasts, but the Romans took it to a new level of grandeur, blending Greek traditions with their own distinctive flair for excess. The Greek symposium was centered around drinking, intellectual conversation, and entertainment, but the Romans redefined this idea. While they maintained the Greek focus on wine and conversation, they expanded the banquet experience to include much more elaborate feasting, intricate entertainment, and a greater emphasis on social status. For example, the Greeks were known for their philosophical discussions at banquets, while the Romans were far more likely to engage in witty banter, political maneuvering, and even stage performances to keep the guests entertained. While the Greek symposium was a more subdued affair, the Roman banquet was nothing short of a theatrical spectacle. Greek influence can also be seen in the types of food served at Roman feasts. The Greeks were known for their use of herbs, fruits, and vegetables, and these ingredients were central to Roman culinary traditions as well. However, the Romans, ever the perfectionists, added their own lavish twist, taking Greek dishes and transforming them into grand, multi-course meals that would be served to guests in a ceremonial manner. For example, the Greeks were fond of dishes like soup and porridge, which the Romans refined, incorporating rich meats, sauces, and garnishes, turning them into complex courses meant to showcase their wealth. Beyond the culinary influence, the Greeks also inspired the Roman approach to wine. The Greeks were the first to introduce the concept of wine drinking as a social activity, an idea that the Romans adopted and amplified. The Greek symposium was all about enjoying wine in moderation, discussing philosophy, and bonding over a shared drink. The Romans, on the other hand, often took wine consumption to an extreme, sometimes drinking to the point of excess, using wine not only as a social tool, but also as a symbol of wealth and indulgence. Historians still debate whether the Romans' adaptation of Greek banquet customs was a deliberate effort to elevate their own social standing, or whether they were simply following the trends set by Greek elites. Some suggest that the Roman adoption of Greek ideas was more about prestige, showing the world that Rome was the new center of culture, just as Athens had been in its prime. Others believe that the Romans genuinely admired Greek intellectual and cultural achievements and sought to replicate them in their own way. As you find yourself at this Roman banquet, notice the blending of cultures around you. The wine flows like the Greek symposium, but the food is a riot of flavors and extravagance, much more than the Greeks ever imagined. Performances unfold before you, and the guests converse not about philosophy, but about politics and power. It's a feast that reflects both the rich history of Greek influence and the unique excesses of Roman society, a harmonious fusion that creates a banquet unlike any other in history. As we continue to unravel the complexities of Roman banquets, one of the most important elements to consider is the role of wine. It wasn't just the centerpiece of every Roman feast. It was a symbol of status, culture, and indulgence. Roman wine, a crucial aspect of their culinary identity, was both a social lubricant and a ceremonial drink. Yet, the way Romans approached wine drinking was far from simple. For the elite, wine was a ritual in itself. The higher the quality, the more prestigious the banquet. Wine would often be served in craters, large vessels used to mix the wine with water. Romans were particular about how they diluted their wine, and the dilution ratio was a mark of social standing. The wealthier classes might drink wine mixed with just a bit of water, savoring the taste of a fine vintage. The less wealthy, however, would find their wine heavily diluted, sometimes to the point where the alcohol content was nearly negligible. This practice wasn't just about taste. It was an indicator of how much wealth and power you held. The host's wine, usually of the best quality, would signal their high social status, while guests of lower rank could expect something less refined. Interestingly, wine was also a tool of social interaction. Banquets were spaces where wine acted as a catalyst for conversation, camaraderie, and, in some cases, manipulation. The rituals of toasts and wine drinking help shape the dynamics of power and alliance at these events. Toasting to various gods, the emperor, or even one's own health, was a way of publicly aligning oneself with power structures. Wine, in this context, became an instrument of diplomacy. Who you drank with, who you toasted, and how much wine you consumed could determine your position in the social order. Of course, wine drinking wasn't all highbrow sophistication. The Romans were known for their love of symposium-style revelry, which often devolved into rowdier behavior once the wine began to flow freely. The idea of getting drunk to enjoy oneself was not frowned upon. After all, many of Rome's most famous poets, writers, and philosophers were known to engage in heavy drinking at banquets, and they often celebrated the effects of intoxication in their work. In fact, some of the most raucous and infamous banquets were those hosted by emperors like Nero and Caligula, where guests would drink excessively and indulge in wild behaviors. Historians still debate the true extent of Roman wine consumption and the role it played in daily life. Was wine just a pleasurable beverage, or did it serve a deeper purpose in the Romans' understanding of social order? Some argue that it was a tool for consolidating power, while others believe that the love for wine was more about pleasure and indulgence. What is clear, however, is that wine played a defining role in Roman culture. Its rituals, social significance, and the power it wielded at banquets. Now, as you sit at this grand Roman feast, you find yourself surrounded by wine-filled cups, toasting to gods and allies alike. Each sip not only quenches your thirst, but connects you to the legacy of a civilization that viewed wine as the drink of the gods, a means of celebrating life, and sometimes a way to push the boundaries of social conduct. The air around you is thick with laughter, the sound of clinking goblets, and the unmistakable hum of revelry as the banquet continues, fueled by the intoxicating allure of wine. As we continue our journey through the world of Roman feasts, let's now turn our attention to the etiquette that governed these banquets. Despite the lavish excess and indulgence, Roman banquets were still highly structured events, with specific rules of behavior that guests were expected to follow. These rules weren't just about decorum. They were a way of reinforcing social order, ensuring that the host maintained control and that the guests adhered to the hierarchies of Roman society. One of the most important elements of banquet etiquette was the act of reclining. The Romans didn't sit at tables and chairs like we do today. Instead, they reclined on couches, lying on their sides while eating. This was an act of luxury and leisure, reserved for the elite. The position of your reclining spot was a clear indication of your status. The host would recline in the most prominent position, often raised above the rest, and the most important guests would sit closest to them. The further away from the host you reclined, the lower your social rank. Additionally, The Romans had strict rules about how guests should behave during the meal. It was expected that guests would participate in conversation, but they were also supposed to be polite and restrained in their speech. While the wealthy and powerful could engage in witty repartee and political discourse, there was an unspoken rule that guests should not dominate the conversation or engage in contentious arguments. Banquets were meant to be an opportunity for bonding and building alliances, so overtly aggressive or controversial discussions were frowned upon. The act of eating itself was also governed by rules of etiquette. It was considered impolite to overeat or to eat in a way that was perceived as gluttonous. Roman banquets, despite their indulgence, placed a premium on moderation, at least in terms of public appearance. While it was acceptable to enjoy the meal and indulge in the food, guests were expected to maintain a sense of decorum. In fact, there were even rules around how much food to take and when to stop. If you ate too much, it could be seen as a sign of poor manners, a lack of self-control, or even a display of greed. Historians still argue about how strictly these etiquette rules were followed. Some suggest that the higher echelons of Roman society adhered closely to these formalities, while others believe that the drinking and indulgence often led to a loosening of such rules. After all, as the wine flowed and the conversation became more animated, it's likely that guests sometimes let their guard down and forgot the more formal expectations. Imagine yourself at this Roman banquet, reclining on your plush couch, delicately holding your wine goblet. You're careful not to overeat, mindful of your manners, and making sure to engage in conversation without dominating the room. The food is rich, but you pace yourself, knowing that overeating could bring unwanted attention. You look around and see the others, each in their place according to status, subtly observing the unwritten rules of the feast. This banquet is not just a celebration of food and drink. It's a display of grace, power, and societal harmony, with each guest playing their part according to the script laid out for them by Roman custom. As we continue our exploration of Roman banquets, let's delve into a topic that's often overlooked but essential to understanding the cultural significance of these feasts: the connection between Roman banquets and religion. Although we've touched on religious rituals earlier, it's important to dive deeper into the idea that feasts weren't just an opportunity for indulgence, they were also acts of devotion. In ancient Rome, banquets were frequently tied to religious observances, offering the perfect blend of feasting, honor, and divine celebration. Roman religion played a central role in daily life, and many banquets were held to mark religious festivals, honor the gods, or seek divine favor. The act of feasting was considered a form of worship, and banquets were often framed as offerings to the gods. When hosting a banquet, the Romans would first dedicate the meal to the gods, making toasts and offering prayers for good fortune, health, and success. This wasn't just an act of ritual, it was an essential part of the Roman worldview, where everything from eating to politics was influenced by the divine. One of the most significant deities associated with Roman feasts was Bacchus, the god of wine, revelry, and fertility. Bacchus was central to the Roman drinking culture, and his festivals were often marked by feasts that celebrated indulgence and excess. These banquets, known as bacchanalia, were wild, uninhibited celebrations, where wine flowed freely and guests were encouraged to let go of their inhibitions. These feasts were so associated with excess that they became notorious for their raucous behavior. At the height of the Bacchic celebrations, it was said that participants could drink to the point of delirium, reveling in a frenzied atmosphere that celebrated both the pleasures of the body and the mysteries of the divine. Additionally, banquets were often held to honor specific gods and goddesses depending on the occasion. A banquet for Jupiter, the king of the gods, would be a formal affair marked by reverence and ritual. Guests would offer toasts and sacrifices, thanking Jupiter for his protection and blessings. Meanwhile, a feast in honor of Venus, the goddess of love and beauty, would be more about celebrating beauty and sensuality, often accompanied by music, poetry, and lavish food to set the mood for an evening of love and enjoyment. Historians still debate how much the Romans truly believed in the power of these divine offerings at their feasts. Were these rituals genuinely seen as ways to communicate with the gods, or were they more of a social performance, a way for the elite to demonstrate their piety and reinforce their status? Regardless of the underlying intent, it's clear that these religious feasts were integral to Roman society. They serve both as spiritual acts and as social events, where the sacred and the social intertwined. As you sit at this Roman banquet, the air is thick with the scent of incense, and you hear the host make a toast to Jupiter, raising his goblet high and encouraging everyone to join in. There's a sense of ceremony that surrounds the meal, with each toast and prayer carrying weight. This is more than just a gathering for food. It's a spiritual moment, a shared act of devotion that connects you to something larger than yourself. Even as the wine flows and the entertainment begins, there's a sense that you're participating in a greater ritual, one that ties the indulgence of the feast to the divine forces that govern the world. As we approach the final leg of our journey through the opulent world of Roman banquets, let's shift focus to something that, on the surface, might seem trivial, but was of great importance to the Romans: banquet entertainment. While feasts were primarily about food, wine, and socializing, the Romans understood that the right kind of entertainment could elevate the experience from a mere gathering into something unforgettable. The entertainment at a Roman banquet was often as elaborate as the food, serving both as diversion and as a means to solidify the host's status among the elite. One of the most common forms of entertainment at Roman banquets was musical performances. The Romans were fond of music, and it was a critical part of their social life. Musicians, often slaves or freedmen, would be hired to perform during the evening, providing background music to accompany the feast. These musicians played various instruments, from the lyre, a stringed instrument, to the aulos, a double-piped wind instrument, creating a festive atmosphere while also serving as a subtle reminder of the host's wealth and cultural sophistication. In wealthier households, music could be accompanied by poetry readings or even dramatic performances, where professional actors might perform short comedic or tragic scenes to entertain the guests. Dancing was another form of entertainment that appeared frequently at Roman feasts. It wasn't uncommon for slaves or hired entertainers to perform acrobatic dances or staged routines to amuse the guests. Roman dance styles were a mix of Greek and indigenous Italian traditions, often involving graceful and rhythmic movements that were meant to evoke admiration. However, at the more extravagant banquets, you might also see a bit of body humor in the form of more provocative or comedic dances. Some historians suggest that the entertainment was a reflection of the host's desire to display not only their wealth, but also their ability to curate a refined or occasionally rowdy atmosphere for their guests. But it wasn't just about music and dancing. The Romans loved games, and banquets often featured contests or challenges to keep the guests entertained. These could range from simple drinking games to more elaborate feats of strength or skill. One of the most famous forms of entertainment was the ludus, game, that involved various physical challenges, such as throwing javelins or mock wrestling. While such games might not have been as grand as the gladiatorial contests held in the arena, they still provided an exciting, competitive element to the evening, further emphasizing the host's wealth and creativity. Historians still debate the nature of these performances and games. Were they simply for entertainment, or did they serve a deeper purpose in the context of Roman society? Some argue that they were a way to reinforce social hierarchies, with the entertainment designed to keep lower status individuals, like slaves or freedmen, occupied while their masters reclined in comfort. Others suggest that the entertainment was a way for guests to bond with each other, breaking down barriers and fostering a sense of camaraderie through shared experiences. Imagine yourself at this feast, surrounded by the gentle strumming of the lyre and the rhythmic tapping of dancers' feet. The atmosphere is lively, but there's an air of elegance in the way the entertainers move. A professional actor takes the stage, and the guests pause their conversations, eyes focused on the performance. The entertainment at this banquet is more than a mere distraction. It's an essential part of the experience, a way of immersing you further into the world of Roman luxury and spectacle. As we reach the final chapter of our exploration into the world of Roman banquets, let's reflect on their decline and how these once magnificent gatherings ultimately faded into history. The extravagant feasts of ancient Rome, which defined the opulence and excess of the empire, didn't last forever. As the empire itself began to crumble, so too did the world of indulgence and excess that surrounded Roman banquets. One of the main reasons behind the decline of these lavish events was the shifting political and economic landscape of Rome. As the empire faced internal strife, financial crises, and external invasions, the wealth that once funded these extravagant banquets began to dwindle. The once powerful elites found themselves under pressure, not only from political instability, but also from growing social unrest. The vast gulf between the rich and poor became even more pronounced, and the lavish banquets of the elite came to be seen as a symbol of everything that was wrong with Roman society. As the empire faced more pressing matters, the focus on such indulgence began to wane, and banquets became less frequent and less extravagant. Additionally, the rise of Christianity and its growing influence in the empire played a role in the decline of Roman banquets. The early Christian church condemned the excesses of Roman society, including the indulgence found in banquets. As Christianity gained traction, it gradually replaced the old pagan rituals and traditions that had been so central to Roman life, including the religious and ceremonial aspects of feasting. The Church's teachings, with their emphasis on modesty and temperance, stood in stark contrast to the lavish, wine-soaked celebrations of the Roman elite. Over time, the grand banquets that once defined Roman high society began to shrink in scale and importance. The lavish feasts became less about power, prestige, and indulgence, and more about simple gatherings with family and friends. The political and social significance of the banquet diminished, as did the grandeur and spectacle. By the time the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 AD, the grandeur of the imperial banquets had long since faded into memory. But even as Roman banquets began to decline, their influence on later cultures remained. The traditions of hospitality, the use of food as a social and political tool, and the importance of communal gatherings continued to shape social life for centuries to come. The concept of the banquet as both a celebration and a reflection of social order found its way into the courts of medieval Europe and beyond, continuing to evolve in different forms. So, as you sit back and reflect on the grandeur of Roman feasts, it's clear that these banquets were more than just opportunities to indulge. They were central to the way Romans saw themselves, their power, and their place in the world. As the empire fell, the grand banquets that defined its elite faded, but their legacy lived on in the stories, traditions, and cultural practices that followed. Now, as the feast comes to an end, the wine has been poured, the conversations have faded, and the entertainment slows down. The echoes of the laughter and clinking goblets are distant memories, like the ancient empire itself, a reminder of a time when indulgence, excess, and spectacle ruled the night.